In this session, we are going to introduce CLIQUE, a grid-based subspace clustering algorithm. This algorithm, CLIQUE, actually is an abbreviation of clustering in Quest. Quest is an IBM data mining system. It was developed by a group of researchers at IBM. It was published in SIGMOD 1998 conference. CLIQUE is a density-based, grid-based subspace clustering algorithm. Why it is grid-based? Because it discretizes the data space through a grid structure and estimates the density by counting the number of points in the grid cell. Why it is a density-based? Because a cluster actually is a maximum set of connected dense units in a subspace. That means a unit is dense is a fraction of the total data points contained in the units exceeds a certain parameter. Then you try to connect those dense units into a structure, into a cluster. That means it is density-based. But why it is subspace clustering? Because it starts from a low dimension, like a single dimension. For this particular subspace, you try to find neighborhood dense cells in the arbitrary subspace, and you can grow into 2D, 3D, and find the maximum number of dimensions. In the subspace, it contains clusters. It also discovers some minimum description of the clusters. That means for this particular algorithm, it automatically identifies the subspaces of a high-dimension data space that allow a better clustering than the original space using the a priori principle. Let's look at an example. Okay. Suppose we want to find the clusters based on salary, age, and number of vacation weeks. And we can first start from one dimension to find where are the dense points. For example, if you just look at salary, you may find the salary, the dense points is 20K to 50K. That part is pretty dense, especially around 40K. You find that the ages actually is pretty dense between 30 to 50, okay? And it's very few, probably the lower ones. Then based on number of vacation, you probably can see the vacation is clustered around 2 to 4 weeks. That means we find a dense region in each subspace, then generate their minimum descriptions. Then we use this dense region to find the promising candidates in 2D space based on the a priori principle. Simply says you find it's dense in 1D on salary and 1D on age. Then you probably can find their combined one. That means you try to find clusters within this candidate space. Okay. Similarly, you can find clusters within the candidate's space in salary and vacations. Okay. Then we can repeat this process in the level-wise manner in the high-dimension subspace using the a priori principle. Simply says, if you find a dense in this 2D part and this 2D part, then you might find the candidates in the 3D region based on their intersections. So the major step of CLIQUE algorithm is first try to identify subspace that contains clusters. That means we can partition the database space into the grid structure, then find the number of points that lie inside each cell of the partition. Then try to identify the subspaces that contain the clusters using the a priori principle. Then that means we try to identify clusters as a second step, determine the dense units in our subspace of the interest. Then we determine the connected dense units in all the subspaces of interest. Then we will generate the minimum descriptions of the cluster. That means determine the maximum regions that cover the cluster of the connected dense units, then determine the minimum cover of each cluster. Okay. So this method, the interesting points is it automatically finds subspaces of the highest dimensionality as long as a high density cluster exists in those subspace. Because you find a 2D, you try to find their intersection. If it's a 2D form cluster, the intersection at a 3D space, likely you may be able to find clusters. It is insensitive to the order of records in input, and also does not assume a particular data distribution. Okay. And it scales linearly with the size of the input, has good scalability on the number of dimensions in the data when the data increases. So this is a quite efficient algorithm. The weakness of the method essentially is because we use the grid-based clustering approach. So the quality of the results will depend on how to choose the number of widths of the partitions and the grid cells. Nevertheless, it's a very interesting subspace clustering method. Finally, I should say all the original papers on these density-based and grid-based clustering are listed here. Also, for Shahrul Agrawal and Reddy's book, there are two chapters. One is called Density-Based Clustering by Martin Ester, another called Grid-Based Clustering by Chen, Wang, and Batista. They have very good summary and also introduce many more methods on density-based clustering and grid-based clustering methods.